Good morning. My video in English, Kolkramaro speaking. The date of this video is 12 November 2021. A very short instructional, practical video for employees being faced with forced or so-called mandatory vaccination in the workplace. It's very clear that employers across South Africa are copying and pasting the same flawed policy over and over and over again, and therefore it becomes very easy for me to assist employees by just simply giving a few pointers as to how to oppose this. The process usually starts out with the employees being called together in a staff meeting or on a Zoom meeting where they are informed by the employer that a mandatory vaccination policy will be introduced into the workplace. Now remember, we're way past the deadline as set by the guidelines of the Department of Labour relating to this, so that makes it, the introduction of it at this point in time, illegal per se. However, it has not filtered through to employers. They don't realize that they are now acting ultra-virus, in other words, outside the bounds of law. Therefore, you will have to counter this. When the employer informs you as such, when that is the information coming to you, then you ask the employer for the following. You ask the employer for the legislation in South Africa that grants him the authority to have a mandatory vaccination program in the workplace. So that is the first thing that you ask him. It will be of much value if you can do that in writing. If the employer then persists and he goes over to the next phase, and that phase being to ask you to provide testing, PCR testing on a regular basis if you do not want to vaccinate, then you ask the employer that he must show to you in writing through ways of an affidavit that he has been exempted from Section 7 to the Employment Equity Act, because that act and that specific section relates to testing of employees in the workplace for all diseases and all illnesses. If the employer goes ahead to say that you must apply for exemption of the policy, then you ask the employer once again in terms of which law of general application in South Africa are your constitutional rights being infringed upon, and that he must deliver a copy of that law of that act to you before you apply for any exemptions to his policy. Now, this video is very short, and the information I give here is very concise. There's a specific reason why, and I will disclose that right at the end of the video. If the employer in his policy says that he is conducting all this in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, then you ask the employer that he must provide proof to you of which sections of the Occupational Health and Safety Act authorizes him to do whatever he is doing. If he says this is now in terms of the Mining Health Act, then you ask him for the specific sections of that legislation. If the employer says to you that you may not enter his workplace unless you are vaccinated or unless you can prove that you do not have COVID through a PCR test, then you ask the employer for the legislation authorizing him from stopping you going into the workplace. If he cannot provide that, then you must inform him, better so in writing, that then you will sit at home and it is fine, you accept his unwillingness to let you in on the workplace, but he must realize that he will have to pay you for the time that you are at home. The reason why I instruct employees or I advise employees to follow the following route is that on none of the questions that you are asking the employer will the employer be able to provide such proof, because there is no legal framework in South Africa for mandatory vaccination. We know it by now. It's been crystallized. We know the Minister of Labour, the Minister of Health said it in so many words. It is in writing in Parliament. There is no such law in South Africa. There cannot be mandatory vaccination coupled to dismissal in South Africa within the current framework of law and legislation. So, if you ask the employer to provide actual proof on which he is standing on this mandatory vaccination policy in his workplace, he will not be able to answer you, and therefore it becomes null and void. As simple as that. I hope you find this video instructional. I hope you send it on to all your work colleagues and also to other employers so that they are aware of the pitfalls, the traps that has been set by unethical and sometimes just simply plain stupid advice being given by attorneys, advocates, and consultants relating to this issue. I also remind you that it is not the vast majority of employers who has fallen for this wrong advice. The vast majority of employers out there do not have so-called mandatory vaccination in the workplace. In Europe, and especially in the United States, they tried to enforce this through law, and as you know, in the United States, this was struck down very recently over this past weekend by the appeals court and declared illegal to do so. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Skalk van der Merwe signing off, and we will speak again over this weekend.